Good evening. Please welcome to the stage the Executive Director, ACLU, Pennsylvania, Mike Lee.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? As you heard, my name is Mike Lee, and I humbly serve as Executive Director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Pennsylvania, or ACLU. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to using all of our tools in our tool belt, such as litigation, advocacy, communication, and public education, to defend, protect, and expand civil liberties here in Pennsylvania and across the country. We also have a very long history of promoting racial justice and equal protection under the law. And as a fun side note, one of our founding chapter members in 1951 is the great Sadie T.M. Alexander, who will soon be memorialized with a statue in front of Municipal Service Building. But y'all came here for something else, not to hear me brag about ACLU. Tonight's event is going to be fantastic. We have two amazing speakers. Tonight's speaker is Keisha N. Blain, who is a professor of Africana Studies and History at Brown University in the frigid northeastern part of our country called Rhode Island. She is a Guggenheim, Carnegie, and New America Fellow, that's 3 fellows, and the author of a National Book Circle Critics Award finalist for a book entitled Until I Am Free. Tonight, she will be speaking with us about her incredible new book, Without Fear, Black Women and the Making of Human Rights. 2 of my favorite topics. This book demonstrates the crucial role Black women have played in over 200 years of shaping the idea and practice of human rights. This conversation will be moderated by the great Timothy Welbeck, who is the director for the Center of Anti-Racism at Temple University. He's a civil rights attorney by training and practice, and he's also a scholar of law, race, and critical studies, you know, all the things that are being attacked right now by the federal government. And his work has allowed him to contribute to various media outlets such as CNN, CBS, BBC Radio 4, The Washington Post, The Philadelphia Inquirer, NPR, The New York Times, and Revolt TV. So basically what I'm saying is a lot of people ask Tim what they should know about race, culture, and cultural studies. So please join me in welcoming both Keisha and Timothy to the stage now for a wonderful conversation.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to join you all. I'm excited to have this conversation with Dr. Blain. She is a scholar and is truly telling some of our most important stories. And so I'm thrilled to be with you here tonight, Dr. Blain.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
And so with that said, first of all, congratulations. This is the 9th book?
The 8th.
Okay. Getting a little ahead of myself, but congratulations on your 8th book. It's truly an important work. In a lot of ways, it's becoming more prescient as the days go on. And I'd like to really just begin with that. In a climate like ours where people are becoming increasingly apprehensive to even say things like Black or to champion women, you have a book that's celebrating and humanizing Black women who've shaped human rights. And so I'd love to hear what motivated you to write the book to begin with.
Yes, well, thanks again, and thank you to all of you for being here. I started writing Without Fear actually at the same time that I was finishing up my book on Fannie Lou Hamer. So this is 2020. I was in the process of really putting the final touches on Until I Am Free. And one of the things that happened in the process of writing the book on Hamer is that I started thinking a lot about civil rights, certainly, and human rights. And one of the things that led me down this path was a quote from Fannie Lou Hamer in which she said, I'm no longer fighting for equal rights, I'm fighting for human rights. And sometimes she would say it differently, but to essentially capture the same concept, that I'm no longer fighting for civil rights, I'm fighting for human rights. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that particular quote to understand why she said it, what she meant by it, and what it really, I think, captured about the moment. So this is early 1970s. And I connected her statement to her own experience, as I discussed in Until I Am Free. Hamer traveled to Guinea in 1964. I talk about the fact that her travel to Guinea opened up her eyes in many ways. It helped her think about the struggle for civil rights, not in isolation, but very much connected to, I think, the larger Black freedom struggle. She was certainly thinking about what was happening on the African continent. And I think that the statement was also connected, that it was her way of saying that the struggle for rights within the U.S. context could really not be discussed in isolation from everything that was happening across the globe. And I think she was grappling with this concept of human rights, which, as I explained in the book, are fundamental God-given rights, essentially, that, which is to say that if it's God-given, that it really doesn't necessarily matter what a government recognizes or not recognizes, because they don't give the rights and they don't have the ability to take the rights away, at least conceptually. And so she, I think, really emphasized in that quote the significance of human rights as a framework. And I started grappling more with it. And the question that I asked was, well, what would the history of human rights look like if I centered Black women, certainly women like Hamer, in her lifetime, but what if I started much earlier? What would the history of human rights look like, starting in the early 19th century, for example, and even going beyond Hamer's lifetime, so thinking about it into the more contemporary moment, and that's when I started putting this book together in earnest. So it has been a journey. Of course, to your point, to your earlier remarks, I could not have predicted that we would be in this moment when I was in the process of writing the book. In fact, I mentioned 2020, so this was a very important year, as you all know, right, in terms of political and social movements. There was a lot of energy, people really responding to the police killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and far too many others. And there was a sense that people were pretty much sick and tired of what was happening, right? And they were ready to see changes happening in real time, and they were ready to call out state-sanctioned violence and to say it has to come to an end. So it was a moment of possibility. And so I started writing the book in this moment of possibility, and could not have imagined that I would complete the book and that it would come out in a very different moment, in a moment where people would say to me, "Are you sure you want to release the book now?" Which is a question I never thought I would have to be asked. Or, are you worried about having to talk about this topic in this political climate? Are you worried about DEI and people perhaps connecting your work to this, of course, anti-DEI climate? And so these are the kinds of questions that I could not have predicted. But I would argue that the book matters in this moment.
It does.
And I think, even to the title, which, if we get a chance, we'll talk a little bit more about the title, but just even the title, I think, conveys a message for all of us. And that seems so, I think, urgent and significant in this moment, because there's a lot to be fearful about, quite frankly. And this is true in the context of, I think, really all of the women's lives who I discussed. There were many reasons to be afraid, but it didn't stop them from doing the work. They recognized the importance of doing it and pushing past the fear, because it's such significant work, and it just has to be done. So I think about this moment and the fact that while some people are trying to stop the teaching of Black history, or they're trying to limit the kinds of narratives like the ones that I tell from circulating across the nation, that in response, it's important to tell the story still. And in response, it's important to release these kinds of books, really as a counter to these narratives. And so I'm pleased to be part of that, and I'm grateful to all of you for I think, taking the time to engage this work and taking it seriously. So thank you for that.
That's so remarkable, and in so many ways, you are participating in a continuum of brave truth tellers and shaping not only the course of history, but even the course of the future. I love how the book presents some of these women from history as three-dimensional characters, because we often have these caricatures of them, and that limit who they were. Can you talk about how the book challenges the political history of many of these black women that we periodically talk about in history?
Yes, what's very interesting, which of course makes sense when we think about the history of the United States, is that a lot of the books that we write on black women's history are very much told through the lens of the civil rights movement. That's the one thing that's happening. The other thing that's happening is that I think many scholars are very much consumed with the question of what are the steps that black people took, and certainly black women, what are the steps they took following emancipation in order to essentially demonstrate, I think, that they were, and still are, of course, part of the national polity. So it was a question of citizenship, which is an important question, certainly, to grapple with, especially when you think about the context of slavery. We understand even in terms of the law, but also in practice, how black people essentially were not even recognized as people, right? We think about the institution of slavery relegating black people to property as an example. And so in the aftermath of slavery, then part of the effort is to really, I think, demonstrate widely that no, in fact, we are part of this nation, we're citizens, we should therefore have citizenship rights. That is part of the argument as it relates to voting rights and so on. That story is important. I'm certainly not suggesting that we shouldn't pay attention to that, but in doing so, I think what has happened is we haven't paid as much attention to, I think, the global dimensions of the story and the way in which someone like Ida B. Wells, who you referenced earlier, how she's more than the anti-lynching campaign, she's more than the anti-lynching crusader, rather, who's leading this anti-lynching campaign in the United States. She's also doing this at a global scale, so that's one thing. But more to the point, she's drawing connections between what's happening in the U.S. She's drawing connections between the racial violence that's happening in the U.S. To human rights abuses that's happening across the world. She's drawing connections between the U.S. and Cuba, for example, in the late 19th century. She's thinking about how the plight of black people can be compared to the Armenian genocide. I mean, these are things that she says in the late 19th century, but we don't necessarily focus on that, I think, in the scholarly literature. And part of what I wanted to do was say, well, let's take a look at these women and move beyond just a conversation about citizenship rights and the struggle for rights in terms of voting or federal protection, which is what Ida B. Wells certainly called for. And let's think about the way that they were linking, I think, these struggles to really to global issues. And they were thinking far beyond the borders of the United States. So for another example is someone like Madam C.J. Walker. And the way that we're told that she's a self-made millionaire. We're told that she has this very successful business, and all of that is true, but we don't seem to focus on the fact that she played a critical role in facilitating, as I talk about in the book, connections between Black Americans and Japanese delegates. In the context of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, I talk about how she orchestrates a meeting with the delegates who are traveling to Paris. I talk about how she's collaborating with a group of activists in establishing a Black internationalist organization, the International League for Darker Peoples, or the ILDP. I talk about the fact that she travels to Haiti in 1913. She's visiting political prisoners. She's bringing attention to the plight of political prisoners in Haiti, and she's talking about the conditions of the prison. And those are just a few examples of how these women's stories are told, right, initially, I think, in the mainstream in this very one-dimensional way. It's, right, Madam C.J. Walker and here and entrepreneurship. That is important, but I'm saying, actually, let's talk about her in the global context. Let's talk about her contributions broadly outside of the borders of the U.S. And similarly, I'm doing that with Ida B. Wells and many women who are well known to readers. And then I'm introducing lots of women who I think readers certainly don't know about and are meeting them for the first time in the book. So it's really an attempt to go beyond what I see as a limited framework and a limited kind of, the limited way in which we tend to talk about these figures, which I think speak to perhaps the overemphasis on kind of United States history, right? I mean, I'm certainly a historian of the U.S., but I'm always interested in what's happening here and how that connects to what's happening in other places. And I think when you grapple with those stories, you're able to see history in a new light, and that's what I do in this book.
Truly you do in so many different ways. I think you really highlighted many of some of the insightful connections that you make. As you were looking at the more expansive view that these women had for human rights, did any of these connections surprise you as you were seeing, like Madam C.J. Walker's advocacy in Haiti and some of her international trips, and like you mentioned, Fannie Lou Hamer's trip to Guinea, and how that shaped her worldview? Was there anything that surprised you as you were beginning to make these broader connections?
Absolutely. I think one of the women who I talk about in the book who I've always just found fascinating, and I say always because even though I started writing the book as I was finishing up the Hamer book, I drew on a lot of material that I have been collecting for the last 10 years. So in many ways, it's both a new process, but also reflective of a longer journey of thinking about these women's lives and their activism. And one of the women who I encountered earlier in my career, actually while I was writing my dissertation, now more than 10 years ago, is a woman by the name of Pearl Sherrod. And this is, and of course, just an amazing figure, working class black woman from Detroit in the 1930s who's deeply interested in Afro-Asian solidarity. And that in and of itself is fascinating when you think about the longer history, but also when you think about the way that she's moving in the world. And so what do I mean? In the book, I talk about how she shows up at this conference in Vancouver in 1937. And she shows up because she finds out that there's a conference taking place. It's a Pan-Pacific Women's Association conference. And it's a gathering that brings together white women and Asian women. And they're talking about unity and rights and all of these very important concepts. But what's very clear is that black women are not included in this conversation. And Pearl Sherrod essentially shows up and she crashes the party. She walks to the front, she gets to the podium, and she pretty much calls it out. And she tells them, like, whatever you're imagining you're doing here, and of course I'm paraphrasing, she's saying to them, right, none of this matters if you're not going to take into consideration the experiences of black women, right? Don't even think that you are, in fact, advancing any kind of conception of human rights if indeed it is going to be so limited in scope. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. And it's captured in the historical record. Certainly people write about it, attendees write about it. They're captivated by this woman and the moment. And I'm just really grappling with this and thinking what it means for this black working class woman who doesn't have the connections, who doesn't have the resources, for what I could tell, doesn't have a lot of formal education, right? And all of the markers of success, so to speak, that we tend to emphasize, even in today's context, right? She doesn't have all of these things, but she has a deep conviction and a drive and a clear vision of the world that for her needs to center and include, at the very least include, people of African descent. And she shows up and she makes that known. And it's not just that she gave this powerful speech, but it's that the speech moved people to act. And as I talk about in the book, the organization then opens up a space for black women, and they begin to invite black women to their gatherings. And it just shows really the power of an ordinary individual. And I to the question of surprising, I'm always struck by these kinds of narratives because, of course, we live our daily lives and we have our own challenges. And I think about what it means to go from having to think about putting food on your table, right? Pearl Sherrod, at the time, she's a single mother. She's struggling to make ends meet. Like, she has a lot going on in her mind, and yet she's also thinking about human rights, right? And just the power of that advocacy, the ability to recognize that, yes, you do have your own challenges. There are clearly, like, as we talk about bread and butter issues to grapple with, but you also have to be thinking at multiple levels. and the ability to do so seamlessly, to grapple with the local, to grapple with the national, and then to be thinking about the global dialogue, and to do so from a position, right, from a position where you don't have power, right, in that sense, at least not in the traditional sense, you don't have traditional, right, in the traditional sense, you don't have power, you don't have resources, you don't have access, but you find a way.
Yes.
You make a way, and you leave this powerful legacy. And that, to me, sometimes I just marvel at these women's lives, and I just think about what it means, especially in this moment. We have so much going on, and I find inspiration in these stories. So surprising, yes, but truly powerful narratives.
I love the connections that you're making there, particularly with Pearl Sherrod, and it reminds me of one of my favorite anecdotes from the book when you mentioned early in chapter 1 how Ida B. Wells Barnett went to speak to President McKinley with her 5-month-old in tow.
Yes.
And made that difficult trip from Chicago to Washington, D.C. And it really underscores this point that you're making here, that these were women who didn't necessarily have extravagant means. Some of them didn't have significant formal education, but they saw that they still had the capacity to change the social order of their day and to fight the ills of their day in so many ways. You talk about people like Aretha McKinley as well. Could you talk some more about just some of these stories and bring them to life some more?
Yes. Wow, where to begin? So many. As you were talking, a woman who came to mind immediately was Mary Church Terrell, who I think is certainly well known. At least aspects of her life is well known. And what I find remarkable about her too is she did so much. I mean, there are times, as I was writing the book, I was mapping just the organizations. I mean, she would go from organization to organization. I was just like, geez, you're joining everything. And, but when you really pay attention, there's a strategy behind it. There's something else that she did too that I found fascinating. She was the kind of person, she would work with you for a minute, and if you were aligned and this was a space in which she could do what she needed to do, she was there. And as soon as things started shifting, she's out. She was like, you don't serve me, we're done. Yes. And I love that about her, because she just had a clear mission. She knew what she needed to do, just didn't waste time. You almost had the sense that she felt like every minute counted, no time wasted, right? If you're not about the business, we're done. And she just moved seamlessly throughout the world. And there's a moment where she shows up in 1919, right, pivotal year, and she's in Zurich, Switzerland, and she's pushing for human rights. And she's certainly talking about it. She's giving this powerful speech. She's proposing all of these changes that need to take place. She's literally calling for a number of changes globally that, as I talk about in the book, really, in so many ways, set the stage for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. And it's just comparing the two and thinking about, wow, how remarkable. The Mary Church Terrell, right, just already talking about these issues long before the United Nations, right, long before these more formal institutions, and yet her story just not centered even in the history of human rights, which I find so disturbing. When you read mainstream accounts on human rights history, these women don't receive the attention that they should receive, despite the work that they were doing. So she's someone that I find remarkable, who I highlight in the book. Another woman who I talk about, to your point, Aretha McKinley. Aretha McKinley, I did not know anything about her until I started doing research for the book. In fact, I was not even looking for her. I was looking for another woman, because I was writing a section on the United Nations, and I wanted to talk about women who were working at the United Nations behind the scenes, whose names have not appeared in books. And in fact, I talk about several women whose names appear for the very first time, right, in my book. And these were women who were secretaries, right, just quietly in the room, taking notes, oftentimes the only Black woman present in these official proceedings, especially in the early years. And so I just, I started digging, trying to find information about who they were, how they ended up at the UN, what it meant to be there, and all of that. And while digging to find more about these other women, I came across Aretha McKinley, and I came across her because she shows up in a number of newspapers, and they black newspapers, and they were like, "Oh, this remarkable black woman lobbyist who's just leaving a mark and changing people's minds about human rights." And I thought, "Oh, really? Tell me more." So I started looking into her, and truly remarkable story. She, as I mentioned, was a lobbyist in D.C. I talk about her life. She moves from Virginia, and then at one point she's in New York, and she eventually ends up in D.C. And she's part of a council, essentially, a council that's very interested in two things, in civil rights and human rights. And this comes out of a number of groups, but essentially we're talking about sororities, right? Black sororities coming together. At one point, also working with black fraternities, but there's a long story there, a split that takes place. But nonetheless, out of these networks, she's essentially working with a number of individuals, trying to push, certainly lobbying for laws, for policies that would expand voting rights for black people in the U.S. She's doing that. But at the same time, she's also hosting workshops at Howard University to talk about human rights, to talk about developments taking place in the Caribbean, to talk about what's happening on the African continent. And she was constantly telling people, yes, we have to talk about voting rights, we have to push for this, but we also need to be thinking about what's happening internationally, because what's happening outside of the U.S. is just as important as what's happening within. And in fact, it's shaping what's happening within. And there's a way in which we could use, right, we could tap into these larger struggles to strengthen our movement, right, on a national level. On the one hand, forging transnational solidarities, as an example, right, these political networks that are taking place transnationally. She was pushing that, emphasizing this as a strategy, and saying that this was going to be part of the effort to bring about change in the United States. It was also a question of being able to shame the United States, right? To show to the rest of the world, look at how this nation that's pretending to be a beacon of democracy, right? Look at how they're treating black people. And in fact, they're treating black people as less than human, and that's a problem. So she was someone who I think understood the power of the language of human rights. And so I grapple with that. And excuse me, and she's doing that at the very same moment that you have someone like Ella Baker, who, as I talk about in the book, which is amazing, the two of them ended up being part of the same NAACP chapter in New York, which is just fascinating. But Aretha McKinley, she's doing all of that at the same time that Ella Baker, as she's organizing with the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, as she's encouraging these students to really stand up and make a difference, right? They're organizing sit-ins. And so I tell the story of the kind of the national, right, the stories we know, right? The sit-ins, the marches. And then I show how in the midst of all of that is someone like Aretha McKinley, who's certainly deeply tapped into this conversation, but taking it one step further. And that's part of the argument of the book, is just that these women saw the struggle for civil and human rights as deeply intertwined, and they never lost sight of the national context, but they were always attentive to the global.
That makes so much sense. And one of the beauties of even the stories that you were just telling there from the book about, for example, Ella Baker and Aretha McKinley being a part of the same chapter is, I thought so much about the community that these black women were forging. You even talk about that in Until I'm Free. One of the anecdotes that really jumped out at me still was how Fannie Lou Hamer said she didn't know she had the right to vote until Ella Baker came and did a voting registration rally in Ruleville, Mississippi. And so I would love for you to even expound more on some of this community, some of these black women were forging, because we often think about them in isolation, but so many of them were working in tandem with each other.
Yes, I think this is what's so powerful in the book. We see a number of spaces, and that's one of the interesting arguments that I'm making too. I'm essentially saying that long before we had these established human rights organizations, right? The ones that we recognize as such, that Black women were at the center and at the forefront of human rights advocacy through an array of organizations, whether religious. So I talk about Black churches as spaces in which women were advocating for human rights. I include in the narrative some who we've solely classified as missionaries in the right, which seems to imply that, well, they're traveling the world and they're just trying to bring people into the fold, so to speak, and they're trying to expand churches. Well, they were doing more than that, it turns out. And some of them, yes, were drawing on the Bible, absolutely drawing inspiration from it, but they were arguing for the importance of human rights and emphasizing that, slavery, for example, needed to end because it was absolutely, yes, a sin, but also it was proof that the nation had in fact, right, not acknowledged human rights. So there were ways in which they were using the space of religious spaces or churches in which to work together to make these kinds of arguments. And then sororities that I brought up as just a perfect space in which many of these women were coming together to push these arguments. The other thing too that I highlight in the book, which is very fascinating, I spent a lot of time with very short-lived organizations. And I do that intentionally because part of what happens, I think, in the historical record is that, well, if an organization has only existed for a year or two, the assumption is, well, it's not that important, right? We pay more attention to the one that might have been around for 10 or 20 or even, much longer. But as an example, I talk about the Sojourners for Truth and Justice. It was an organization that existed from about 1951 to 1952. But it's this crucial space in which Black women, many radical in their politics, came together and absolutely drew the connections. They were dealing with certainly they were grappling with the larger struggle for civil rights in the U.S. context, but they were also connecting with activists in South Africa, right, as part of the anti-apartheid movement. They were deeply invested in supporting that alongside of their efforts to, challenge, inequality in terms of certainly economic inequality, certainly pointing out inconsistencies in the law and the way that Black women were being mistreated. So they were linking all of these things, talking about how Black men were being treated in the military. I mean, they were truly grappling with both national and global issues as it pertains to Black people's experiences, but they were short-lived. And one of the reasons they don't receive a lot of attention is because, the thinking is, well, the organization was essentially done by 52, but what I show is that, well, if you pay attention to the ideas, you see how this story actually moves far beyond 52, right, into the 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s, and truly, when you move beyond the limited framework of just the organization, you see how these individuals continue to carry the mantle forward. And you see how these ideas shape generation after generation. So it really is, I think, a powerful story about, yes, the individual setting out to make a difference, but the individual tapping into multiple communities, whether religious, whether political, or a combination of both. Pearl Sherrod, who I mentioned earlier, at one point was involved in the Nation of Islam, right? So to the point, we see diversity of religious experience in this book. And then later on, she's involved in an organization called the Development of Our Own, which is an organization that's deeply invested in working with the Japanese government in the 1930s. And I chuckle because you have to understand how dangerous this is for a Black woman to be in such deep dialogue with anyone connected to Japan. But one of the things that I talk about in the book, which I also found remarkable, is she was able to do that work because she was invisible then as she's invisible now, right? So there's a time, and I chuckle about this, how, and I've seen this too in other contexts, and I've discussed a little bit about this in my first book, Set the World on Fire, but even at one point, you see this if you go through FBI records, for example, federal officials are showing up And of course, they're showing up, they're trying to investigate because they want to squash any kind of black radical politics, of course. And they were like, okay, well, who's running around telling black people to forge collaborations with Japanese? You know, we need to bring this to an end. And they show up at Pearl Sherrod's apartment at one point, and they document, they're like, well, nothing to see here, just some black woman, you know, hosting a dinner party, like, you know, and they totally miss it. It's more than a dinner party, actually. But that's the, right, I mean, that's the power that she's able to use in a way, that invisibility, right, because she's a woman, you know, they don't imagine that she's doing anything of importance, but she's able to keep the movement alive. She's able to push these ideas and to do so through the dinner party at home, right? And so it just becomes, I think, another avenue through which to see black women's politics, informal politics, but quite, I think, influential still. And that's another aspect of the story that I think is important to emphasize. So to your earlier question, lots of groups show up, so many as we move across time and space, and sometimes networks being formed. You know, if we talk about Kadi Diallo, maybe I can talk, a bit about just, you know, the kinds of networks that are formed that are not necessarily organizations per se, but powerful networks still that allow people to do this work effectively.
Yeah, we can talk about Kadi Diallo now.
Yeah.
So one of I think the powerful things that you talk about in the book is so many of these women took personal tragedy and used that as a launching point into advocacy. Ida B. Wells famously with the murder of her friends. But you talk about in the present day, people like Kadi Diallo, and who in a lot of ways used not only personal tragedy, but a sense of bravery and courage to coalition build and to advocate for change.
Yes.
Could you talk about that some?
Yes, and so for those who might not be familiar, so Kadi Diallo is the mother of Amadou Diallo. Amadou Diallo was gunned down by New York City police officers in 1999. You might remember this because I think to this day, just talking about it is just quite disheartening. But he was shot at 41 times. And he was standing outside of the vestibule of his apartment, minding his own business, you know. And police officers approached. They said they called out to him, and he didn't respond. They also said that he reached for something. Well, you can see where this leads, right? It's the typical kind of narrative. Turns out he didn't have a weapon or anything. He had a wallet. But by the time anyone finds out about any of this, it's too late. And he was brutally killed. He was an immigrant from Guinea. He had been in New York for a short time, working hard, you know, going to school, studying, came to the U.S. With a dream and just killed senselessly. And his mother, whose story I tell in the book, and I do that through a combination of grappling with archival material, historical newspapers, and covering her story. But I also asked if she would talk to me, about her story, and she did, and I'm grateful for that. And one of the things that I highlight in the book is how she ultimately goes through this transformation. She tells me that she goes from a person who has initially no interest in politics, really. She's living her life in Guinea at the time. And she gets the call that her son has been killed. She rushes to New York initially to find out what happened, to claim his body. She's trying to plan a funeral. All that is happening, but it becomes clear to her that her life will never be the same, one, and that she can't simply return to the way things were. But losing her son effectively politicized her in many ways, but more to the point, I think it caused her to move into human rights advocacy, which is what I talk about in the book, that transformation, that process by which she realizes that she needs to fight for justice, not only for him, but for so many others who are facing similar circumstances. And I connected that to your question earlier about community and groups, because one of the things that I find so striking about her story, she told me that when she decided that she wanted to be involved in this larger movement to bring about change, a number of activists in New York, including Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, several others at the time, pulled her aside and pretty much said, listen, before you can do anything, you need to understand the history. And it was and she tells me that it was like a wake-up call because she was so consumed with, okay, yes, she needs to get justice for her son, but they were like, no, no, no. Yes, it's true you need to get justice for your son, but you've got to understand that his killing is part of a pattern, like a pattern that connects to, right, Michael Stewart in the 1980s. I mean, she was just saying, like, they opened up her eyes to this history. It was both the history of New York, right, and policing, but it was also the broader history in terms of the U.S. And so she said that it was like through these networks, that she was able to become a part of, that she learned enough about the movement to then figure out her place in it. And I just thought that was such a powerful lesson, that it was, she had this drive, she knew what she wanted, but people said, wait, before we take another step, you've got to understand how it all connects, right, to this larger story. And she just valued that, but it's also, I talk about her as being part of this network, this community of activists. To this day, she's a mentor, she's supporting others. In fact, many others, sadly, who has over the years lost their sons, in particular, and their daughters too, to police violence and police killings, have turned to Kadi Diallo as someone who has been offering advice and support, and so she's drawn on her own painful experience, and she has established a foundation. She's doing all this work in the present day. But for her, she taps into a network, a community of activists who are really committed to bringing about changes in certainly in New York, but across the nation, and to connect what they're going through to a global, to really elevate their concerns on a global scale. And she's part of that effort. And I talk about the way that she's speaking about Amadou Diallo's killing, and making a case that it is in fact a question of human rights, right? That part of making a case for human rights is to say that we should all have the right to be able to stand outside of our apartments, right, minding our own business, and not have to lose our lives in this senseless manner. And so it really is both a story of, as I was saying earlier, the individual impulse, but also the way that it connects to a number of groups in different places at different moments. And as we move across time and space, we just see Black women building upon a long legacy, truly, both at the intellectual sense that they're drawing on these ideas, but they're also, I think, utilizing similar tactics in different places. And it really is a story of continuity, which is clear when you see how the challenges persist, right, generation after generation, yet people continue to fight back.
That's so remarkable. Dr. Blain, I have so many more questions for you, but I'm going to pause because I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. But before I do, one of the things that I keep thinking about, both hearing you talk today and reading the book, one of the things you talked about was just the religious connection, and I thought about the biblical text. There's a chapter in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, that talks about some of the patriarchs of the Torah, and some people call it the Hall of Fame of Faith. But as the chapter progresses, it gets to people who become unnamed, and it talks about unimaginable horrors that they faced in order to keep the faith intact. And one of the things it says, of whom the world was not worthy, when it gets to them. And I thought about how you give names to some of these women who get forgotten in history, who had faith in humanity in so many different ways, and how their stories almost would have gone untold, but you are telling them in this way. And so I was wondering if there was anything else that you wanted to share in that vein, particularly just in the importance of combing through these records, going back to the 19th century at times, to make sure these stories were maintained.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I thought immediately about the story that I tell of Marguerite Cartwright, who's another individual, unknown, but certainly now known. And I tell her story in the context of the All-African People's Conference that takes place in Accra, Ghana in 1958. And this is a conference that many scholars have written about, and they talk about this is the pivotal moment, certainly in the struggle for anti-colonialism. It's a gathering in which Kwame Nkrumah is at the center. He's bringing together all of these world leaders, of course, male leaders, and they're talking about a path for liberation, as they're looking forward, certainly with the momentum of Ghana's independence the year prior, and they're thinking about, well, how do we bring liberation to all of the African continent? So there's just a moment of possibility. But part of what has happened is the way that the story gets told in the, the mainstream narratives is this is a gathering of course, talented and courageous, important Black men, but it's a story of Black men coming together and making a difference. So then I start with that narrative of all these men gathered, but the chapter isn't about these men. It's about the woman who's not seen, who's not named, but she's there, and she's listening, and she's taking notes. And I talk about, I carry the story from the person who's there, taking notes and observing, to then the person who goes back. And who's this person? So this is Marguerite Cartwright. She is a professor at the time, but she's also a columnist. So she's there gathering information for the Pittsburgh Courier, gathering information for New York Amsterdam News. She returns to the United States, and she writes a series of columns on the importance of this gathering for Black Americans, right? And I talk about the fact that she uses her pen, right, in a similar way that Nkrumah uses his voice. And she's able to shape the narrative and make a case for African American readers, and saying to them, you need to know what is taking place in these conversations, because in fact, these conversations are also going to inform the way we strategize at the national level. And she's not only at the center of the conversations in terms of her writings, but she's making these connections. She's building relationships with, I talk about how remarkable it is. She gets to know Nkrumah quite well. And he becomes one of many African leaders that she's writing to personally, connecting with, and all her personal papers, all of these letters from world leaders, and she builds these connections, and she doesn't just have these connections for herself. She's really playing the role of connector. So there are moments where she says to them, let me connect you to, right, this activist in the US doing important work. Talk to this person. Let me make sure you know this person. At one point, I talk about how someone's visiting from Nigeria, an official is visiting, and she says, let me take you through Harlem. And she takes him through Harlem, and she introduces him to all of these folks, and he's just stunned by all of this, but really deeply appreciative of the role that she plays. And so all of this is to say that I unfold a story that shows, right, the way that these women were making a difference. That it wasn't, yes, it's great to talk about the people in the official positions, with those with the seat at the table, talking about a way forward. Like, that's important. I'm not dismissing that, but it's also important to think about the way that women are able to move and say, well, I may not have a seat at the table. Doesn't mean I won't be part of this dialogue. Doesn't mean I won't even help shape this dialogue. I will. And she's able to do so through her writings, through these relationships, and it truly is a remarkable story of, yet again, a woman invisible, yes, hidden in so many ways, yet I bring her story to the forefront to show that this too is an important part of the history that needs to be told in order to have a full sense of all the players in this conversation. And so I do think, to your point, it is such a powerful analogy, and I'm glad that you alluded to the Bible, just because, so many of these women, especially in the context of the 19th century, they were thinking about it through biblical term, right? They were drawing inspiration from the Bible in order to make these arguments, so I am glad to hear that you would draw the connection to my own work. So thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you again, Dr. Blain. In the same way that Dr. Cartwright helped to make these connections, so were you. You made history in exploring history. You were the first to access her archives, and so in the making of this book. But I do want to leave opportunity for you all to ask questions, and so there are people walking around with microphones. Please be mindful of we are coming up on our time, so ask your question, try to be succinct, and we will go from there. So we'll start on my right, your left. So gentleman with looks like an Eagles.
Yes, thank you.
Please, okay. Go Birds.
Indeed, indeed. So, Dr. Blain, you mentioned sisterhood and the sororities, and I was wondering, In terms of being without fear, your own research, how have you been inspired by particularly other Black women historians and scholars? I'm thinking in particular about Barbara Savage, I'm thinking about Martha Jones, I'm thinking about Carlin Ferrari.
Yeah, thank you so much. And actually, I just finished an event with Martha Jones.
Wow.
We were discussing the book in Baltimore, and in fact, I was just talking to someone, asking someone if they knew Barbara Savage, whose work has been just so inspiring. So to your question, quite frankly, I could not do this work in isolation. It's just a fact. I couldn't do it in isolation. And when you're writing a book like this, and I was reflecting on this too as I was writing the introduction, I chuckle about this, but I have this very long, outrageously long footnote in which I'm like, this book builds on, scholarship, Black women's history that dates back, 20-something years at least, and I'm just listing books and books and books and books, and eventually I had to say, and more, because I couldn't actually list all of them. But quite frankly, I couldn't do this work without the remarkable scholarship of those you've named and so many others. And in fact, I think as I've published this book, I'm in dialogue with others too. So someone who comes to mind is a good friend, LaShawn Harris, who just published a book on Eleanor Bumpurs, right? And I've been thinking about that since I was just talking about Kadi Diallo in the context of New York, and she wrote this book called Tell Her Story that just came out a couple weeks before mine, in which she's grappling with the Eleanor Bumpurs case, which similarly galvanized certainly folks in New York, but also I think across the nation, yet again, in this case, another act of police violence and brutality. And she talks about the significance of the case, and she really, I think, centers Eleanor Bumpurs far beyond the tragic way in which she died, but she tells her story. She talks about who she was as a person, and that's an aspect, believe it or not, that actually has not been told. So it's a groundbreaking work in that regard. And I do see our books in dialogue, as just one example. I have a firm belief, and of course, this is a theme recurring, that it comes directly from the Bible, this concept of iron sharpens iron. And then I believe that deeply, that I can only do my best work if I'm in dialogue with others who are brilliant and doing important work. And so I'm able to learn from them, and that helps me think about things differently. So yes, I can certainly present the work in a new way and see different avenues and different questions I might pursue, but none of it is possible without what has been written and what continues to be written. So to your question, so many I'm inspired by, so thank you for asking.
Thank you for that great question. So we have a gentleman here in the glasses, and then we have a question in the front row.
Hi. Yes. My name is El Brown. I'm actually a Brown alum, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
My question, you were saying the civic rights versus human rights. I wonder if you would say it's fair to say, it brings to mind two things. One thing that you didn't say, but that I've learned in political science, is that the personal is political. Mm-hmm. And then the second is about the Bible and about the 10 Commandments and about that basic soul-saving type of commandments.
Yes.
And so do you think that given her biblical and religious background and the fact that some things the government civics just can't, some domains they can't cross into, that she may have been referencing those things among others possibly?
Mm-hmm. Yes, great question. And in fact, something that I didn't talk about tonight, but I think it is so central to this conversation, especially as we're grappling with the kind of civil versus human rights, and that is to the theme of human dignity, right? Which is a basic question of how do you treat other people? And you reference the 10 Commandments, and one of the things that I think really comes through these women's writings and speeches is that they're saying to everyone, treat people the way you want to be treated. And if you just do that, then we don't even have to debate, right, the Constitution, and we don't even have to do all that. It's just simple: treat people the way you want to be treated, right? And so it's a question of human dignity, and that absolutely is tied to the question you're asking about the biblical influence, certainly, and as I said, and I think I referenced this. I discuss women from diverse backgrounds, so some are more religious than others, and some certainly, I think, pull directly from the Bible in ways that others did not. And so I don't want to give the impression that this is a story of women who were all thinking, exact same way. But to your point, I think it was about framing the conversation differently. And let me also step back and say, which I also didn't say earlier, when I spoke about Hamer and the phrase, I'm no longer fighting for equal rights, I'm fighting for human rights, part of what was also happening there was she was pushing back against people who had this very simplistic framing that, well, black folks just want what white folks have, right? Like, no, that's ridiculous. Actually, the argument is a bit more sophisticated than that. And so that's another impulse, I think, to her statement, and that's what a lot of these women are getting to, right? Framing the discussion differently, and also in doing so, I think, putting a whole lot of pressure on the United States, and that was in and of itself a strategy to say, we don't have to debate whether you think the Constitution applies to me or not. It's actually higher than that.
That's great. We have another question in the front row. Ms. Weathers. And this might be our last question. We'll see.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for this conversation. This has been amazing. Look, today has been a hard day for me, so I think what is it that you hope specifically for Black women to get from this book in the sense of how we move forward? Because I know there still at times is a lot of sentiment of like we're resting, the 92%. It's like everything that we're seeing happening, basically, not even in a sense of we told you so, but just seeing as things like we tried to get ahead of this, we tried to galvanize, which is something that you have done a lifetime worth of work proving that Black women have done this, being a part of international movements, always advocating not just for ourselves but for others. And I think a lot of Black women just feel like it's Blue Monday, with the Annie Lee photo, or I should say painting, and it's like a level of exhaustion. And so would you consider this most recent body of work, is this a way to maybe galvanize us back into feeling energized to kind of like, okay, slap your wig back on, let's do this? Or is it like, what does this serve for you?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope so. So on the one hand, I certainly want the work to inspire people, but in some ways it's tragic too, because when you really read the book and from start to finish, and you reflect on, Elizabeth Freeman in the 1790s, making a case for human rights and doing so through the courts and being successful at it, no less, right, in the state of Massachusetts. And then in that last chapter, in the epilogue, I'm talking to you about Opal, or formerly Opal, now Ayo Tometi, who's speaking to the United Nations General Assembly and talking about state-sanctioned violence and making a case that this is in fact a human rights issue. You really do get the sense that on the one hand, there is progress. I think you can see that certainly as you're sort of moving through the text, a lot of change happens, but you also get the sense that this is, as I say in the epilogue, it's an ongoing struggle. And I think once you know that, we started the conversation about human rights, and these are God-given, and therefore if they're God-given, they cannot be taken away. Like, that is true. But it's also true that once you make certain strides, whether we're talking about human rights in the context of the law, as an example, right, as a concrete thing, that you can lose that. And we're seeing this in real time. And so part of the strategy is also once you've obtained it, you you have to hold on to it, and you have to fight, right, and constantly fight to sustain it, because you don't want to lose it, and you certainly want to be able to see your children and grandchildren, right, those who come after you, experience the rights and privileges that you and others have fought long and hard for. And I get it. Trust me when I tell you, I get it. I was one of the people who said, I'm done, I'm resting, right? But then there's a moment where you're like, actually, okay, rest if you need to, take a moment, breathe. This is a lot we've endured. But you can't retreat entirely, right? And so part of it is making the steps forward. And to the earlier point that we were talking about earlier, you really can't do it alone. You should not try to do it alone. It's too much to carry it alone. And so one of the things that I hope people do take from the book is the power of that community. Being able to tap into just an array of different communities and networks and spaces where you will have someone to help you stand up, right? Someone to hold your hand, someone to be there for you, and you know, offer that support in kind, and together move forward. But the key is to move forward. You cannot be stagnant, and you can't take a backseat entirely and do nothing. I simply think that the Black women may say it, but we don't actually. At the end of the day, we do, and I talk about this in the intro, that I think it's because of the nature of our lives and the way that we experience oppression at multiple levels, that we are uniquely positioned to challenge injustice in the world. And it, you know, that is certainly, that can feel like a burden, certainly, but I see it as a responsibility. And if you see it through that lens, it means that we can't be complacent. We have work to do. It's not easy, but we have to find a way to move forward and to do so in community. So I hope that that's one of the lessons that people take from the book as well.
Thank you for that, Dr. Blain. We are out of time, but she is being gracious with her time, and we'll sign books upstairs. So there's an opportunity for you to get a chance to speak to her briefly, and get a book signed. Briefly, she can't be here all night, but I do want to thank you all for coming tonight. This is such an important book. Dr. Blain is such a pivotal historian and scholar, particularly for this moment, and this is another important collection to an already impressive body of work that she's produced. And so I'd like to ask you to help me thanking her for coming tonight.
Thank you all.